Oh, very gloomy is the house of woe, where tears are falling while the bell is knelling, with all the dark solemnities that show that death is in the dwelling. In this compilation video, I invite you to revisit some of the cases of poltergeists and hauntings featured on my channel in 2023. My name is Laura, and you are watching The Paranormal Scholar. In September 1954, Bill Farrer and his wife Barbara moved into a new home in the historic market town of Pontefract, England. They were a young family with a 2-year-old daughter named Jane, and so 30 East Drive with its 3 bedrooms and, for the time, luxurious indoor toilet should have made the ideal home. And yet, less than a year later, they moved out, convincing a second family, the Pritchards, to swap houses with them. After all, the Farrers were terrified of their home. Objects would move of their own volition, voices were heard echoing in empty rooms, and rips and tears would spontaneously appear on soft furnishings. In particular, Bill and Barbara feared for their daughter. She would, so they claimed, be found crying, her face inexplicably covered in blood and scratches. The family had no pets on who to blame their injuries, and even after they placed cotton mitts over the little girl's hands, the bloody wounds continued to appear. Jane cried every night, leaving her parents utterly confused as to what to do. That was until one day when Barbara rushed upstairs in response to her child's crying, and found a pillow had been placed over her face. After that, the answer was clear. They had to flee. And so they did, leaving the house and its dark occupier to the Pritchard family, thus marking the lesser-known origins of what would soon become the infamous case of the East Drive poltergeist, the diabolical Black Monk of Pontefract. My name is Laura, and you are watching The Paranormal Scholar. Much has been said and written about the Black Monk of Pontefract. Regarded as a classic British case of poltergeist phenomena on par with the infamous Enfield poltergeist, it loosely inspired a 2012 horror movie and has been investigated via visits to the property associated with the happenings by innumerable paranormal teams. Perhaps one of the most famous, or at least significant visits to 30 East Drive took place decades earlier, in August 1980, before the publication of the book Poltergeist, when Colin Wilson, the well-known writer of more than 100 books on subjects including mysticism and the paranormal, visited the, by then, long-suffering Pritchard family. Wilson had been tipped off by another researcher by the name of Tom Cunniff. A local amateur historian, he had stumbled across newspaper clippings dating to the late 1960s that alleged tremendously that a Pontefract family had experienced poltergeist phenomena caused by the ghost of a 16th century monk who had been executed for assaulting and murdering several young victims. When Cunniff discovered that the family was still living in the same house, he knew he had to visit them to hear their testimonies. Not long afterwards, he contacted Colin Wilson, and so it was that Wilson made the journey to the Yorkshire town to interview the family. According to the details recorded in his book, the activity began not as you might expect, more than 10 years after the house swap with the Farrers. Despite Bill Farrer's claim that his young daughter was regularly and aggressively assaulted by some unseen force within the house, it seems as though the Pritchard family, comprising a mother, father, son and daughter, lived there in relative peace until the August of 1966. It was a Thursday, and most of the family, Joe Pritchard, his wife Jean, and their then 12-year-old daughter Diane, were away on holiday in Devon. They had left their 15-year-old son Philip, along with Jean's mother Sarah Scholes, at the house. The arrangement, to begin with at least, seemed to suit the family. Philip had reached the age when holidays with the family lose their attraction, and so spent much of his time happily reading in the garden. On that Thursday he was outside as such. When he returned indoors to make himself a drink, he noticed something peculiar. His grandmother, sitting in the living room engrossed in her knitting, oblivious to the cloud of grey-white dust that was floating in the air around her. It was said to have been chalk-like and powdery, and more than that, appeared to be falling, not from the ceiling, but from a level below Philip's head. The top half of the room was perfectly clear. The curious dust seemed to be materializing from nothing. When Sarah went to get help to clean it up from her other daughter, Marie Kelly, they found more strangeness in the kitchen. Several large pools of water on the floor. They seemed to have no origin or explanation. Meanwhile, the dust in the living room continued to fall like a miniature snowstorm, with a fine white layer of the unidentified material having formed on the furniture, and even as a film on top of the cup of tea Philip had made for his grandmother. As the younger woman tried to mop up in the kitchen, new puddles would supposedly manifest. Pulling up the linoleum revealed no leak underneath, neither was water falling from above. And so, just like the dust in the other room, the puddles seemed to have come from nowhere. The odd domestic drama is then described as heightening when, after the water supply to the house was turned off by a helpful neighbour, the water company was called to the property. Pipes were checked, the linoleum once again lifted, and drains examined, poked and rodded. Nothing was broken or blocked, and so some strange sort of condensation caused by the summer weather was the water company's man's best explanation. About an hour after he left, the mysterious puddles stopped appearing. Before the day was over, however, more odd happenings were reported. Sugar and tea leaves were emptied from their dispensers in the kitchen, sprinkled all over the countertops. Cupboards were vibrated and shook, loud bangs were heard coming from upstairs, and a plant, usually located at the foot of the staircase, was transported halfway up, minus its pot. That, somehow, had been moved separately, being found on the landing above. Unable to tolerate the house any longer, Philip and his grandmother left and slept with Aunt Marie for the night. Vic Kelly, Marie's husband, supposedly unhappy at the strange situation, is described as phoning the police to have them check on the house. Everything seemed normal. There was no intruder or anything otherwise out of the ordinary. And yet, around midnight, just as Vic Kelly left the house for the final time that day, two small paintings are said to have fallen from the wall, with the glass being shattered on one of Jean and Joe Pritchard's wedding photos. It had also, so it is alleged, been slashed from end to end, as if with a sharp knife. Chilled, Vic Kelly simply closed the front door of 30 East Drive and walked back to his own home. Thus began the paranormal activity for the Pritchard family. When Jean, Joe and their daughter Diane returned from their holiday, Sarah relayed the unsettling happenings. There was disbelief, but also, as Sarah told her daughter and son-in-law, supposedly 3 loud distinct bangs and a cold wind which blew through the house. After that, there was nothing more, with the activity disappearing, at least for the next 2 years. For, according to the testimonies recorded by Colin Wilson, the activity at 30 East Drive truly began for the Pritchards in 1968. The strangeness seems to have restarted when Jean decided to redecorate her daughter's bedroom. Mysterious temperature changes were reported, as were inexplicable bangs and knocks, and then, sensationally, a paintbrush being flung across the room by unseen hands, supposedly missing Jean's face by only a fraction of an inch. It is even claimed that Mrs. Pritchard witnessed, in the dim of the night as she went to the bathroom, a long strip of wallpaper standing on end and swaying like a cobra. There was no one holding it, and when she went to grab it, it fell to the floor. Horrifically, the carpet sweeper is then said to have flew up into the air, swinging around as if being used as a club by an invisible giant. Screaming, Jean dropped onto all fours and rushed back to her bedroom, as wallpaper and other things continued to be thrown towards her. And so, the unseen presence in the house had returned, and was, so it seemed, more aggressive than ever, and was for some reason focused on Diane's bedroom. What followed next has been described as 9 months of chaos, a peculiar gestation period during which all manner of violent activity was reported. Bangs and thumps would be heard coming from Diane's bedroom to such a physically aggressive degree that she occasionally took to sleeping in her parents' room. Ornaments would be thrown as well as levitated. The lights would be turned off repeatedly along with the main switchboard. One time, the entire contents of the family's china cabinet is said to have been thrown out onto the floor, with not a single precious item smashed or chipped in the process. A particularly chilling incident, which signalled an increase in the seriousness of the activity, saw the lights go out and a huge shadow appear on the wall. Diane is said to have witnessed this first-hand and up close in the hall, while her mother scrambled with a torch to turn the lights back on. As the teenage girl watched on, a hall stand, described as a heavy piece of furniture made of oak, reportedly floated up into the air and moved towards her. Tripping as she tried to get away from it, Diane fell so that her back was against the stairs, and the hall stand on top of her. The heavy piece of furniture pressed down on her, pinning her against the stairs, as another weighty object, the electric sewing machine which had been on top of the stand, fell onto her also. When the lights came on and revealed her breathless entrapment, her family rushed to aid her. But the stand was too heavy, too solid in its placement for it to be moved. Joe and Jean heaved and struggled to free their child, and yet, strangely, fear aside, Diane was fine. She was not, as one might expect, being crushed. The heavy piece of furniture was simply being held in place by some unseen force, just enough to keep her trapped, but not enough to hurt her. Instructed to relax, the force adjusted, and the hall stand and sewing machine were able to be removed. The alleged poltergeist thus had, one can say, a fascination with Diane Pritchard. In addition to the hall stand incident, it was reported that she would be tossed from her bed as many as 4 times in a night by the unseen entity. Her bedroom was reported to become icy cold, and she would even tell her parents that it felt as though someone else was with her in the room. On one occasion, as she stood in the living room combing her hair in the mirror, a brass crucifix is said to have leapt from the shelf and struck her in the back. Not merely that, it stuck to her like a magnet against iron. Whatever had done it was, so it seemed, holding it against her. When the crucifix finally came free, her mother inspected her and found what has been described as a cross-shaped red mark on her skin between her shoulder blades. The injury supposedly remained for days. And so, before too long, 30 East Drive earns something of a local reputation. After being featured in 2 Yorkshire newspapers in September 1968, people would either actively avoid the house or seek to engage with its alleged hauntedness. Ghost hunters attempted to gain admission, with it even reported that a group of students who had asked for permission to camp in the garden were forced to content themselves with the huge round grass verge in front of the house when Jean Pritchard rejected their request. Even from such a distance, however, it is said that they heard assorted bangs and crashes, with it becoming somewhat usual for the Pritchard family's neighbours to experience the activity from inside their own homes. The noises were supposedly that loud. Not merely that, when the family's possessions, indeed the entire contents of the upstairs rooms of the house, were allegedly thrown out of the windows and onto the ground below, it was impossible for others in the area to deny something strange was going on. Eventually, the family took to calling their unwanted houseguest Mr. Nobody, and then later Fred. As much as he tried to force them to leave, the Pritchards remained. Certainly, when a local vicar called Reverend Davy came to advise the family, telling them that there was something evil in their house and that they should move, Jean is said to have scoffed and replied something along the lines of, "Why should I be driven out of my home by a ghost?" And certainly, this was a view which Jean embraced wholeheartedly. As bad as the happenings became, she continued. Spilled food, a favourite activity for Mr. Nobody, would be meticulously swept away. Jam, smeared over door handles and covered in toilet paper, was wiped away. And china plates and cups tossed onto the floor were cleaned and restacked in their cabinet. The family was not going to be chased away, not even when both Jean and Joe saw a very tall, dim figure with a hood over their head standing in the doorway of their bedroom. They had been in bed, and upon hearing the door creak open, had turned to see the terrifying apparition standing there. Before too long, others reported seeing a tall figure wearing a long hooded garment as well. At night, scared in their rooms, members of the family also reported hearing loud, laboured breathing outside of their doors. Thus, it was clear that Mr. Nobody, Fred, or as he was increasingly known, the monk, was becoming more powerful. The activity is reported to have reached its zenith one evening when the lights went out, and Diane, so she, her mother and brother alleged, was dragged up the stairs by her throat. The teenage girl's cardigan, so Colin Wilson records in his book, was stretched out in front of her as if Fred was tugging at it with one hand, whilst his other clamped around her neck. Roused into action by her screams of terror, Philip and Jean rushed to pull Diane back down the stairs, but they were both repelled. Regardless, Diane then found herself free. According to Philip, it was as though his thought of trying to touch the presence had caused it to let go of his sister. Inspecting the shaking and terrified girl in the light, the family saw that her throat was covered with red finger marks. And so the family was terrified. Whilst they did not want to leave their home, they certainly wanted whatever lived there with them to leave. Contacting religious men, praying and sprinkling the interior of the property with holy water all did little to stop the happenings. If anything, it made it worse. Thus, eventually, in an act of seeming desperation, the Pritchards turned to garlic for help. Supposedly, one of Joe's friends, recently returned from Scotland, told of how the crofters there hung cloves of garlic over doors and windows to keep out spirits. Fascinatingly, when they did the same, the activity dwindled, decreased, and then finally disappeared. Thus, what had started for the Pritchards in August 1966 had ceased for 2 years, then returned in 1968, was over by May 1969. At the time of his meeting with the family in 1980, Colin Wilson had nothing to report about ongoing activity. And so, if these reports are as true as they are alleged, the happenings at 30 East Drive appear to be a cut-and-dry case of poltergeist activity, very much similar to many other reported instances of noisy spirit hauntings, from the 1977 to 79 happenings in Enfield, London, to the equally active paranormal phenomena reported in late 1920s Pune, India. The activity centred on adolescents, first a 15-year-old Philip in 1966 and then later an equivalently aged Diane in 1968, with Wilson even writing that nothing would really happen in the house when Diane was at school. Objects, even things as large and heavy as solid oak furniture, were said to have been moved by unseen hands. Food also seemed to be irresistible to the entity. Just as in the 1928 Pune case, food would mysteriously manifest bite marks, such as in the case of a chicken sandwich at 30 East Drive, and eggs were reported to have been thrown, smashed, and even exploded by Jean and her family. Even the appearance of puddles of water on the kitchen floor right at the beginning of the Pontefract case can be said to be a hallmark of other poltergeist cases, with the highly regarded parapsychological researcher Guy Lyon Playfair even having suggested that the neat little puddles found both in the Pritchards' home and others also allegedly assaulted by poltergeists may be some manner of condensation of the energy used by the entity. That the activity disappeared as the children grew up, slipping through adolescence towards adulthood, is also consistent with other poltergeist cases. And yet there are many who would argue otherwise, that not merely did the activity at 30 East Drive never stop, but that it had predated the Pritchards and their teenage children by over 10 years. Certainly, at the start of this video, I myself referenced a testimony said to have been provided by Bill Farrer, who, along with his wife Barbara and their 2-year-old daughter Jane, lived at the property before the Pritchards. Presented in the 2019 book The Black Monk of Pontefract, this testimony alleges all manner of horrific happenings. a baby girl covered in bloody scratch marks, and even the attempted suffocation of the same child by the, we can only assume, same black monk entity alleged by the Pritchards. And yet, as ominous as these claims are, it is distinctly peculiar that nothing similar was reported by Jean and Joe Pritchard of their young children. Having taken 30 East Drive off the hands of the Farrers in the mid-1950s, they, by the time of the alleged start of the activity in August 1966, had thus been in the house for many years. With Diane 12 years old in 1966, she would have had plenty of opportunities to have been targeted by the Black Monk entity in a similar way to baby Jane Farrer. But as far as we are aware, she wasn't. Why is this so? Of course, that is not to say that an otherworldly entity would act in a logical manner. Perhaps the poltergeist, or whatever it was simply in some sort of paranormal hibernation for a decade or more, making the discrepancy a curious but innocent detail. And yet it can be said to grow, to become all the more curious when one studies its source, the 2019 book, The Black Monk of Pontefract. Indeed, the text's authors, paranormal researcher Richard Estep and the current owner of 30 East Drive, film producer Bill Bungie, make rather a song and dance about how Bill Farrer represents a hitherto unknown origin to the Pontefract case. In the book, this new start is eventually used as a launch pad for their ultimate conclusion that the Black Monk of Pontefract is less likely to be a poltergeist and more likely some manner of demonic entity which remains in the property to this day. And for certain, it is indisputable that the Farrer family not only existed but indeed lived at the property before the Pritchards. There are records aplenty to prove this. In fact, so many records that it can be quite easily said that the authors claim presented, allegedly, via Mr. Farrer in their book, that the family moved into 30 East Drive in September 1954 and were gone within a year due to the horrific activity, can be confidently disproved. For example, an electoral roll dating to the 20th of November 1953, almost a full year before they allegedly moved in, places them at 30 East Drive. Precisely when they moved in, and more importantly, how quickly they moved out, is unclear. Either way, it was not less than 12 months, as is claimed, and so hardly a shotgun stay in a demonic house. Interestingly, in terms of the claims made by the house's current owner, he states that a local census proves that the Farrers lived there in 1954 and thus have a right to comment on its level of demonic infestation. In reality, censuses in the UK occur once every decade, meaning in this case either in 1951 or 1961. Given that the book claims that they were there for less than 12 months after September 1954, such would be impossible. And so either Bill Bungie and his co-writer cannot tell the difference between a census and a register of electors, or they are fluffing the facts. Somewhat ironically, Bungie and Estep, when presenting their alleged evidence, even start their Farrer family chapter with the statement, "Historians know the importance of carrying out extensive research and establishing the facts." Perhaps they should have adhered to their own wisdom, most especially as there are other date discrepancies in their book. And so why is this worthy of mentioning? Is this important in terms of assessing the Black Monk of Pontefract case? I would say that it is very important. After all, one of the strongest, if you will, selling points of the Pontefract case is that it is ongoing and represents over 60 years of continuing, very much physical paranormal activity. When reading the current owner's 2019 book, the reader is regaled with tale after tale and provided with photograph after photograph of dark demonic entities, the sorts of things that no one in their right mind would ever want to encounter in the dark of night, least of all in the uncomfortable confines of 30 East Drive's coal house. For certainly, the coal house at the property is today famously spooky, the site of many scratches and suffocating sensations. It is, we are led to believe, the dark epicenter of the hellish happenings. And yet there is no mention of this in Colin Wilson's authoritative 1981 book which covers the case. The briefest reference is made to a lady's coat being relocated into the tiny room, kept in pristine condition, so we are told, by the thoughtful Black Monk. But other than that, the space is irrelevant. Rather, it is the sitting room, so the Pritchard's interviews reveal, that was considered the most active room. And so, why the present-day focus on the coal house? Could it be that the property's current owner is trying to amp up the theatre of the house by stuffing visitors into a dark, confined space, all while telling them that it is the most violent and overwhelming place in the property? It is certainly suspicious, and should give the measure of the man who currently owns the property, and thus is by default responsible for the case's legacy and preservation. In this way, such suspicions and blatant untruths, to the cynically minded at least, make it very difficult to trust anything which is presented in the book. Not merely that, the persistent posturing of Bungie throughout the book, expressed via his claims, "I am a visual expert, I am a filmmaker, trust me, I would tell you if any one of these images or pieces of footage are fake," adds a deeper layer of distrust, with his claims thus coming across as the equivalent of a meme-ish "trust me bro" post on an internet forum. Add to this some of the undoubtedly fake evidence which has come from the property in recent years, shared both online and via television shows such as Most Haunted, and this becomes a minefield of mistrust. Consider the testimony of John Fraser, the well-respected member of the Council of the Society for Psychical Research, who emailed Bill Bungie on multiple occasions about visiting the property in 2018, and the cynicism rockets off the charts. Not merely were Fraser's requests ignored once he revealed he was a member of the long-standing and reputable SPR, but when he did visit the house, smuggling himself in via another group, he supposedly experienced nothing paranormal whatsoever. Fraser was also keen to highlight the purposefully curated Hollywood horror atmosphere of the location, with many unsettling artifacts, including creepy dolls and porcelain clowns, having been introduced into the house. Designed, so Fraser writes, to prime some people and ultimately give even the most hardened investigator strange and intensive nightmares. And so, in short, such misdirection and mishandling of the case by its present owner can be said to damage the otherwise compelling claims made by the Pritchard family in the late 1960s and early 1980s. For certainly there is much that can be said to be compelling, much which lies in the very claim that the entity stalking 30 East Drive was a poltergeist and not a profit-turning, ever-present demonic being. After all, the happening similarities to other poltergeist cases are incredible, even down to minute details like eggs being consistently destroyed. Given that the phenomena, from what we are led to believe via Wilson and other credible researchers, took the family by surprise, suddenly imposing itself on their otherwise regular family life, it can be argued that they would not have had prior knowledge of similar incidents in other cases. Most especially not in obscure, far-flung cases like the Pune poltergeist, in which egg destruction was reported as having been extremely common. In this way, it can be said that there is much potential in exploring the role played by children, particularly those entering or in the throes of adolescence in poltergeist cases. Might it even be the case that, far from being caused by an external, otherworldly entity, such peculiar happenings are somehow self-manifested, a physical materialization of thoughts and feelings, similar to the concept presented by Carl Jung when he spoke of catalytic exteriorization phenomenon? A young adult like Diane Pritchard, for example, may have felt deeply uncomfortable with her mother wanting to redecorate her bedroom and thus move and meddle with all of her intimate personal possessions. Such an intense feeling, made all the more intense by teenage hormones, might have manifested the physical happenings ascribed to Mr. Nobody. That there is little historical evidence to support the existence of a child predating 16th century monk in Pontefract gives more succor to this theory. And such a notion, which is by no means unheard of in parapsychological circles, need not threaten the paranormal dogma and protectionism which sadly have crept into so many cases and researchers in recent years. Rather than directly dispute the paranormal potentiality of the world, proving such to be true would affirm it, give fresh vigor to it, show that the world in which we live is as magical and mysterious as many of us believe it to be. One does not need to distort facts or piggyback someone else's experiences, manipulating them for your own aims, or worse, even inadvertently generating some manner of thought form or physically aggressive black monk tulpa in order to do so. Sometimes things just are what they are, and we should let them be as such, so that we can observe, study, and evolve from them. On the 19th of June 2006, paranormal investigator Darren Ritson became involved in an unsettling case. A mother was seeking help for her daughter, a woman in her 20s with a 3-year-old son who was said to be in danger. The threat was, so the older lady told the investigator, a dark force that lingered in her daughter's home, frightening her, moving objects, even pieces of furniture, seemingly fixated on her son. She is very frightened, the woman wrote in an email to Ritson, and is willing to get any help possible. After all, the daughter, Marianne, wasn't the only one to experience the activity. Her partner Mark had also experienced the strangeness, including hearing a voice on the baby monitor saying that Robert, their 3-year-old son, was going to fall out of bed. On another occasion, one of the boys' toys, a large cuddly rabbit, was even found moved, sitting in a blue plastic chair at the top of the stairs, a razor-sharp box cutter blade in its hand. It was inexplicable and chilling, and given that the activity had by that point been going on since the previous year, demanded attention. And so Ritson and his friend and fellow investigator Michael Hallowell offered to help, in whatever way that they could, pledging that they would not walk away until the family's invisible intruder was gone. What came next was months of struggle, further and increasing paranormal activity, and even physical injury, all of which has resulted in this case, now known as the South Shields Poltergeist, being lauded as one of the most remarkable British poltergeist cases thus reported in the 21st century. My name is Laura, and you are watching The Paranormal Scholar. By the time Ritson and Hallowell became involved in the case, Marianne Peterworth, her partner Mark, and her young son Robert had already been living with paranormal chaos for several months. Starting in December 2005, the activity was at first subtle. Small objects appeared in odd locations around their North England home. The front door, locked the night before, would be found open in the morning. To begin with, Marianne and Mark blamed the occurrences on each other, small acts that were easy to attribute to each other's forgetfulness. However, as the months progressed, the activity increased, until by the summer of 2006, there was no denying something strange was going on in the Peterworth house. Not only that, it seemed fascinated by Marianne's little boy. A well-mannered and cheery child, Robert told his mother that he had an invisible friend called Sammy, with whom he played in his bedroom. Of course, at only 3 years old, this was nothing unusual, and yet, given the strange activity in the house, Marianne began to wonder whether or not what her son was telling her was more than a simple, childish, imaginary friend. After all, not only did objects in his room move, for example, the constant and mysterious relocation of his little plastic table and chair, they were also thrown. In particular, small items including toy cars and a yellow plastic nut from a toy workbench were said to have been thrown regularly, catapulted by unseen hands so as to ricochet off walls and doors into Marianne. There were even reports of solid-through-solid interactions, where objects, including a cup, were said to have been thrown through solid surfaces, such as a closed window. Then there were the more sinister happenings. Robert's toys were not merely found moved, but arranged in unusual ways. For example, a cuddly rabbit was discovered with a box cutter blade resting on its paw, a sharp and dangerous item that was not previously anywhere near Robert's toys. On another occasion, the boy's rocking horse, an item that had been mysteriously relocated multiple times before, was even found hanging from the loft hatch by its reins. Discovered by Marianne's brother Ian, the offending toy was said to have been subsequently banished from the house, left outside in the garden overnight. The next morning, it was back indoors. No one had moved it, and yet there it was. After that, the family destroyed it. And so it was that in June 2006, the Peterworth house was in crisis. Not merely had the activity been going on for 6 months, been observed by Marianne and Mark, as well as by visitors to their home, including brother Ian and mother June, it was also said to have escalated dramatically in recent weeks. And whilst Robert had thus far escaped injury, Marianne and Mark were both becoming increasingly concerned, not merely for their son's safety, but for their own as well. After all, in addition to having toy cars and other objects launched at them by unseen hands, they also reported being hit by an invisible force on multiple occasions. Mark had even, so the couple claimed, been pushed over, with large objects including stepladders having fallen onto him, seemingly pushed when they were otherwise securely resting against a wall. In this way, when Darren Ritson first got into contact with Marianne, it was clear to him that the household was experiencing symptoms commonly associated with poltergeist activity. Having been interested in the paranormal from a young age, after an adolescent experience in France when a bedside cabinet supposedly rocked from side to side and then inexplicably threw itself across the room, Ritson was by that point well read in all things poltergeist and had something of a local reputation for being a paranormal investigator. Because of this, Ritson counselled Marianne over the phone to remain calm and try to document all of the happenings. Poltergeist activity, so he told her, was usually short-lived, and given that the family had already been experiencing strangeness since December, it would most likely burn itself out sometime soon. And yet, contrary to Ritson's initial assessment, this was not the case at all. Rather, the activity continued to escalate, with the reports which Marianne sent the investigator becoming more and more sensational. Reading the book which Ritson later wrote on the South Shields case, Marianne's diary of activity reveals that a white figure was seen in the bedroom on the 3rd of July. On the 9th, all manner of objects were reported as being thrown or moved, including a heavy chest of drawers. Chillingly, a message was even discovered on one of Robert's childish doodle boards the same day. It read, "Die," and could have only been written, so the mother claimed, by someone other than herself, her partner, or her son. The next day, Marianne invited a priest to come and bless her home. This seemed to stop the activity for a few days. However, by the 13th, the strangeness had resumed and appeared to be, room by room, taking over the entire house. Chairs were moved in the dining room, even so Marianne claimed, while she was sitting on them. Later that same day, at around 10:30 p.m, the chest of drawers was moved yet again, tipped over onto Robert's bed, the little boy tucked up asleep inside of it. Fortunately, the child was uninjured. However, such an act of violence led the couple to abandon the house. That night, they stayed with parents. As they fled, an old bed frame, outside and resting against a wall, is said to have fallen onto Mark, causing him injury. Almost a month since Ritson had first been made aware of the case, it was now time for him to visit the Peterworth house and see the happenings for himself. After all, the activity did not seem to be lessening. If anything, it was getting worse, and the family, by their own admission, were desperate for help. Their well-being, and most importantly the well-being of a 3-year-old child, was at risk. Writing in his book, Ritson is clear to state that he was by no means entirely accepting of the claims presented to him by Marianne and her family. Whilst he had experienced the paranormal for himself and was therefore generally believing of its existence, he could not exclude the possibility of fraud, either intentional or otherwise. Indeed, he knew of other cases in which allegedly poltergeist-plagued individuals had falsified claims for attention, and whilst there was nothing on the surface at least to suggest this in terms of the Peterworth case, he would only be satisfied as to the reality of the happenings if he was able to experience them for himself. And so it was that on a hot July day, he and fellow paranormal investigator Michael Hallowell travelled to 42 Lock Street, South Shields, so as to interview Marianne and Mark and, as he states in his book, carry out some preliminary investigations. Knowing how rare genuine paranormal activity can be, he did not, in all honesty, expect to experience anything on his first visit to the house. And yet, within just a few minutes of heading upstairs to Robert's bedroom, both Ritson and Hallowell were said to have been exposed to all manner of paranormal oddities. Sudden drops in temperature, subtle light-shimmering movements, and, unsettling, one of the plastic nuts on Robert's toy workbench being launched across the room with such force that it made a cracking sound when it struck Marianne's side. As Ritson explains in his book, someone or something had apparently thrown the nut with great force from the northwesterly corner of Robert's bedroom. The nut had travelled with such velocity that it bounced off the door and hit Marianne on the buttock before eventually dropping to the floor. Given that no one was standing in the northwesterly corner of the room, both investigators were flabbergasted. And yet, as time went by, this incident would be remembered as one of the lesser things to have happened in the South Shields house. As has been said previously, much of the activity seemed to focus on the bedroom of 3-year-old Robert. In many ways, it can be said that his bedroom became a veritable circus of paranormal activity. In addition to objects being moved and thrown, Robert himself was eventually found relocated as well, on more than one occasion. A nightmare scenario for any mother, Marianne was horrified when, on the 17th of July, she first discovered her child had been removed from his bed. As recorded in Ritson's book, the family had experienced activity in the house all day. Small objects being pushed over, even transported through closed windows to be thrown out into the garden. Mark even reported being locked inside the toilet, unable to open the door, it being pressured by an unseen force on the other side. It was in the evening, however, that the activity climaxed. It was almost 9 p.m, and fearing that the happenings were getting out of hand, Mark and Marianne again decided to spend the night away from the home, and so went upstairs to wake a sleeping Robert so as to get him dressed and ready to leave. And yet, when they walked into his room, he was no longer in bed. Instead, he was on the floor, tightly swaddled in his quilt, his little plastic table on top of him, its legs pinning him in place, thereby making it impossible for the little boy to move. Rushing to her son, Marianne freed him, before turning him over to check that he was all right. It was then that she realized he was still asleep, but with his eyes wide open. It was as if he was in some sort of trance, she later explained. Holding him to her, it supposedly took some time for the little boy to rouse and return to normal consciousness. On a separate occasion, Robert was again moved. This time his whereabouts wasn't immediately clear to the couple. After a long and frantic search of the house, he was found in one of the wardrobes in the master bedroom, once more constricted, tightly cocooned in a blanket, fast asleep. How he had got there was utterly inexplicable. Then there were the unsettling messages. Written on Robert's magnetic drawing boards, they told the reader to die, and later, just go now. There were also less clear messages, such as a repeated C and U, quite possibly a phonetic text-speak CU, the so-called poltergeist's attempt at letting the family know that they were being watched in their home at all times. For certainly, much of the activity reported by Marianne, her family, and the investigators was of an intimidatory nature. Continuing the theme of Robert's toys being interacted with, on one chilling occasion several cuddly toys were said to have been found hanging from a shelf in Robert's room, with one, the figure of a policeman, having been hung by a cord wrapped tightly around his neck. Marianne was said to have been left distraught by the discovery. After all, there was no way that 3-year-old Robert could have done it. Later, the same toy was discovered with its head torn off. Other sensational activity recorded by the paranormal investigators included the power tripping off in the house, coins apporting in mid-air, perhaps even falling through the ceiling from the upstairs, A strange red liquid, quite possibly blood, appearing in the toilet instead of clean water when it was flushed. A mysterious patch of urine-smelling liquid that seemed to manifest in the middle of Robert's bedroom carpet when the boy was absent from the house, and even loud, weird giggling coming from Robert's bedroom, heard by Marianne through the floor when she was downstairs. In all of this, Darren Ritson was astonished. He knew that what he was experiencing, witnessing with his own eyes, was incredible and rare and also utterly inexplicable. Despite repeatedly telling the family that their troubles would soon be over, had to be over soon, the activity seemed to have no intention of stopping. Speaking in an interview about the case 15 years later, Ritson even expressed how the South Shields poltergeist triggered something of a personal crisis in him. He was, he explained, dealing with something completely unknown, and could see how vicious and cunning and evil it could be. It felt like it would never end and led him to wonder what he had got involved in. All we could do, he explained, was reassure the family and tell them it would eventually end. And yet, when the sinister messages, at first written on Robert's doodle boards, began to be sent via text message to Marianne's mobile phone and even the house's landline, he couldn't help but wonder if it ever would. The first odd texts said to have been received were relatively tame. Sent to the house's landline, one was, as was the case in 2006, read aloud by the phone's automated robotic voice. "Hi," it said. "Hi, hi, hi, hi." Oddly, it had been sent from Mark's mobile phone, which was on the dining table in front of all present, untouched at the time. Determined to eliminate the possibility of fraud, Ritson and Hallowell asked everyone to remove their phones from their pockets and place them on the table beside Mark's. Still, the messages continued to be sent. "Hello, hello," and then, a few moments later, "Sorry." The investigators even removed the battery and SIM card from Mark's phone. Regardless, the messages still came. As the days and weeks passed, the telephonic messages, seemingly sent by whatever was in the house, continued. Marianne received them directly to her mobile phone, and Mark, when away from the house, would receive calls from the landline. Whenever he answered, the line would be dead. With no one in the house, this was considered impossible. It was chilling, especially given how the messages not only increased in frequency, but also in aggression. "Going to die today. Going to get you," one read, sent to Marianne from Mark's inactive phone. Another threatened, "I can get you when awake, and I'll come for you when you're asleep." When Marianne considered leaving the house so as to spend the night with her mother, the poltergeist seemingly intercepted by texting, "Please don't go. I will come with you." Even when the phones were not in use, and in some cases disabled through the removal of their power source, the messages continued to be sent. On one occasion, a friend of the young mother even alleged to have received a message, seemingly from Marianne's phone, stating, "I am going to kill you. I am coming soon." Investigator Darren Ritson was present in the house at the time, and has testified that Marianne had absolutely not sent the message ascribed to her phone. And indeed, why would she want to? She was utterly terrified by what was going on in her home. The receipt of threatening text messages can be said to have marked a shift in the activity in the South Shields house. Previously a nuisance in terms of objects being moved, the entity, or whatever it was, now seemed determined to hurt the family physically. In addition to little Robert being relocated, his bedroom was utterly trashed on numerous occasions. A chest of drawers was thrown, his bed was dragged into the middle of the room, and his little plastic table was mysteriously warped as if exposed to a high temperature. Appropriately terrifying noises, thumps, and even the sound of footsteps stomping back and forth across the room are said to have accompanied the activity. Each time Marianne, as was increasingly her habit, phoned the investigators, desperate for help. Voices are also said to have been heard, both through the baby monitor Marianne used to listen out for her son when she was downstairs, and also eerily from the loft. Both a whispering female voice and an inaudible, deep male voice were said to have been heard. Who they were, or what their purpose, is anyone's guess. The family even reported kitchen knives being thrown by unseen hands around the house, especially at Marianne, with some said to have only narrowly missed her. In a 2021 article, the investigator Darren Ritson even detailed how, on one occasion, he found a large silver knife lying in situ on Robert's bedroom floor, and it was certainly not there previously. If indeed moved there by the so-called poltergeist, it is difficult to draw any other conclusion than one of sinister intention. The most incredible and ominous of all the activity reported, however, can be said to be the physical violence experienced by Mark. Said to have happened multiple times after the activity escalated, he reported feeling a peculiar burning sensation on his body, which, when inspected by lifting up his shirt, was found to be the result of red rashes, scratches and cuts that were not there previously. Indeed, not only were they fresh, they, so those who witnessed them have attested, appeared to develop on his skin as if he was still in the midst of an attack. The first time this happened, he was in bed, trying to sleep. Another time, an alleged attack was witnessed by investigator Michael Hallowell, with video footage said to have been gathered. A later, even more vicious paranormal assault was witnessed by an even larger gathering of investigators and friends who had come to the Peterworth residence in an attempt to flush out the entity and thus relieve the couple. On that occasion, so Darren Ritson recalls, 11 people were there to witness it, and 4 of them had good quality video cameras so as to film the attack as it occurred. Nothing short of brutal blood was drawn, with Mark's skin left in tatters. And yet it was utterly and inexplicably healed within 48 hours. All in all, it is asserted that Mark was physically attacked by the poltergeist 5 times. As Ritson has explained, the strength and ability of this entity seemed to grow bigger and stronger as the days rolled by, as did its sadistic desire to intimidate, terrorize and frighten. Ultimately, he and fellow investigator Michael Hallowell visited 42 Lock Street for 7 months. Quite surprisingly, the activity, from what can be determined, ultimately fizzled out when the family, upon the recommendation of the investigators, took to turning their electricity off at night. Presumably without an active power source to feed it, the happenings faded away. Throughout, the 2 investigators had very little idea as to what Marianne, Mark and Robert were experiencing. All they could say was that it was very real, which, given the nature of the activity reported, is naturally difficult to digest. And yet, when reading Ritson's book on the South Shields poltergeist, it is clear that he and Hallowell, as well as the other investigators and helpers who were invited into the house, went to great lengths to establish the veracity of the happenings. Locked-off cameras, motion alarms, activity logs, interviews with witnesses, photo and video evidence, even independent analysis by professionals, including the prestigious Society for Psychical Research. In addition to this, Ritson and Hallowell spoke with telephone engineers in an attempt to debunk the strange text messages received by both Marianne's mobile phone and the house's landline. The engineers were, so Ritson explained during a 2021 interview, bamboozled. Such telephonic interactions ought to have been impossible. In this way, Ritson and Hallowell ought to be commended for their dedication to documentation during this case. For certainly, such cannot be taken for granted when dealing with the paranormal, most especially when, as was the case in this instance, the terrorizing force attempts to destroy the very evidence that it creates. For, according to Ritson's book, photos and videos on Mark and Marianne's phones were regularly deleted, resulting in a militant-esque chain of command whereby any evidence would be backed up and sent to the investigators as fast as was possible. Similarly, when the blood-like liquid appeared in the toilet instead of clean water, before there was any chance to collect evidence, it was supposedly flushed away, the poltergeist being the one to do so. Of course, such undoubtedly makes it easy for the skeptically minded to take potshots at this case. Why wasn't a sample taken? Surely, if it were real, there would be laboratory evidence. And whilst this may be a fair statement, it is also necessary to consider not merely the exceptional nature of what is being proposed, but also how the family were just trying to live their lives. This was not a science experiment for them, but rather a very frightening, very bewildering time in their lives that they were no doubt pleased to put behind them. Speaking in 2021, Darren Ritson has addressed some of these concerns, stating that, in hindsight, there are many things he would have done differently. For example, in regards to his claim of urine-smelling liquid manifesting on the carpet of Robert's bedroom, he wishes he had thought to take a sample. In the moment, in the midst of such chaos, he simply didn't think to do so. Regardless of these should-have, would-haves, there is still much worthy of praise in the South Shields case. Perhaps some of the best evidence can be said to be that which correlates with other alleged instances of poltergeist activity. After all, it can be said to be distinctly bizarre that there are traits that appear time and time again in poltergeist cases. For example, coins are said to have appeared randomly about Marianne and Mark's house. Such fascination with coins, even to the extent that they appear as if out from thin air before dropping to the floor, is something which has been reported in numerous other cases, including the 1920s Pune poltergeist, as well as in the activity experienced by Eleonora Zugan. Between 1989 and 1991, there was also a well-documented case from South Wales of an allegedly responsive poltergeist that claimed apports of coins, including coins impacting on the floor and walls. By way of comparison, in the South Shields case, coins were at one point apporting so regularly that the investigators recalled making a joke in an attempt to soothe the couple that, if the poltergeist continued manifesting money at such a rate, they would soon be rich. Other similarities can be said to be the appearance of written messages. After all, not only did such messages appear on little Robert's doodleboards and in disturbing text messages, they, so the family have claimed, also appeared on the walls of their home. On one occasion, Marianne is said to have found the ominous phrase RIP written on a wall in her son's bedroom in blue ballpoint pen. This, like the coins, relates to other historic cases of alleged poltergeist infestation, including the activity experienced by the Pillai family in 1920s India, and also the chilling writing found scratched into a wall in the Great Amherst Mystery. In that instance, the focus of the activity was a young woman called Esther Cox. The words on her wall, arguably similar to the aggressive messages received by Marianne, said, "Esther Cox, you are mine to kill." And so, in many ways, the South Shields poltergeist can be said to be a highly remarkable, highly believable case. Naturally, there will always be those who claim otherwise, but for those who are interested in examining paranormal phenomena with clear and willing eyes, this case does stand apart, and might very well represent one of the most important instances of poltergeist activity thus reported in the 21st century. It is well documented and provides much insight into the behaviour of the unseen force which we regard as the poltergeist. And yet, the South Shields case, for all of its believability, can also be said to leave many unanswered questions. Chief amongst them, what caused it all to happen in the first place? Oftentimes, poltergeists, as opposed to regular, run-of-the-mill spirits of the dead, seem to haunt people instead of places. Often these people are adolescent girls. Such was certainly the case with the before-mentioned Eleonora Zugan, and also in other popular stories such as the Enfield poltergeist of the 1970s. In South Shields, the only young person was 3-year-old Robert, and while certainly he may have been the focus, with his imaginary friend Sammy being a good candidate for the supernatural mayhem, by the end of the experience, the investigators were much more convinced that adult Mark was the focus of the activity. Why, we can only speculate. Likewise, the full reason behind why the activity stopped remains a mystery. And so, as is often the case with the paranormal, there are more questions than answers. What can be said, though, is that in the mind of Darren Ritson at least, something strange really did happen in the South Shields house. He just cannot say what. Even 15 years later, he does not have an explanation. He merely knows that it happened and that it affected him, scared him, and will continue to affect and scare him for the rest of his life. After all, some things simply cannot be forgotten. The activity was, in his words, a contagion, some manner of paranormal infection that continues to plague households to this day. Perhaps not publicized, perhaps suffered in silence, but most certainly there. Unseen, unknown, largely disbelieved, and thus empowered to do as it pleases. It is not for no reason that Marianne, Mark, and Robert are pseudonyms. They wish it had never happened, and so likewise, perhaps you ought to wish that it never happens to you. On the 23rd of September 1934, the West Indian newspaper on the island of Grenada reported on unusual disturbances that took place in the capital of St. George's at a cottage at the Botanical Station end of Lothers Lane. The article described how, for the entire week prior, the cottage dwellers were tormented by rainfalls of rocks and mysterious noises occurring between the hours of 7 o'clock and midnight each night. The youngest resident in the home, a teenage girl, was also reported to have seen the apparition of a man, a spectral figure who no one else could see during the disturbances. The article claimed that the unsettling stone-throwing phenomenon attracted hundreds of witnesses and baffled even the most zealous police and voluntary watchers, who, after having searched the house and the surrounding area, were reportedly satisfied that the phenomenon was no hoax. And so, if not a hoax, what was the origin of the paranormal pelting that befell the cottage on Lothers Lane? And more than that, how is it that only 4 months thereafter the building was burnt to the ground by a mysterious fire? Might witchcraft have been to blame? After all, it, alongside other sinister forces, were highlighted both by the local newspaper and the official inquiry into the fire, with it feared that not merely did such otherworldly energies have a grip on the cottage, but that they were interested in, and indeed targeted, at least one occupant within it. My name is Laura, and you are watching The Paranormal Scholar. The cottage on Lothers Lane belonged to Mrs. Excelia Mark, a woman of African descent who lived there with her 2 daughters, Gertrude and Dolly, and granddaughter Ivy, who was the child of her son who lived in Cuba. According to her account, the peculiar happenings erupted with stones falling on the house on the 17th of September at 7 o'clock while she was at home with her daughters and granddaughter. Surprised by the sound of stones falling on the roof, Excelia asked the 15-year-old Ivy to look outside for the culprit behind the pelting. Ivy claimed that when she did, she spotted a man dressed in white about 12 feet away, running down the road and through the gate of the Botanical Gardens. Once he reached the gate, he is said to have stood there, watching her, watching him. However, when Excelia looked to where Ivy pointed, she could see no one, and despite no other physical presence identified on the property, the stoning continued until 11 p.m. Strangely, according to Ivy, while the stones were falling, the man was there at the garden gate, although he was not throwing the stones himself. The pelting event and sighting of a potential suspect disturbed Excelia enough to report it to the police. And so the next day, at around 8 o'clock, a team of investigators led by a Detective Bernardine searched the property. Nothing and no one was found. Confused and curious, the detective is then reported to have hid with his team around the area so as not to alert the potential suspect to their presence. From a concealed position, he claimed to have heard the stones falling on the house, although he could not see anybody throwing them. This was September. According to his account, the stoning continued day and night until November. No one was seen and no arrests were made during that time or in the time after. And oddly, aside from the unidentifiable figure spotted by Ivy, there seemed to have been no suspects either. So unusual and disruptive were the paranormal peltings that they garnered the attention of locals and even the press, who surrounded the cottage every night, eager to experience the strangeness for themselves. And experience it they did. The stones continued to fall without explanation. Considering the phenomenon was witnessed by large crowds of onlookers, if a person, animal, or other material explanation had been responsible, surely such would have been identified by everyone present. As it was, the only sightings in the case were made by the granddaughter Ivy, who on another occasion claimed to have seen the man once again standing by the gate of the botanical gardens. But after investigating together with one of his colleagues, Detective Bernardine did not find anyone at the spot. Regardless, Ivy continued to claim that she spotted the man every time the house was stoned, and, chillingly, sometimes even inside the house, sitting on her bed. And even more disturbingly, after a while she also claimed to have seen the man standing by the botanical gardens accompanied by another man and a woman, one of whom she described as being fairer in complexion, with all of them wearing white. Despite her efforts to point out the man and his companions to several people and the investigators, they were never seen by anyone else but her. In the weeks that followed, Detective Bernardine and his team continued to investigate the phenomena. Remarkably, they are even said to have climbed onto the roof of the house and witnessed the stones falling as if from the skies, and yet remaining stationary where they landed without rolling or moving upon impact. Chillingly, the detective even described how, whilst he was inside the house at a time when all the doors and windows were closed, he heard a sound on the galvanized roof, and a stone fell in front of him without making or leaving any hole. Similar occurrences of stones and sometimes gravel, dust and green limes materializing inside the house or being found inside the morning afterwards were also described by Excelia on different occasions. Not merely that, she also claimed that furniture, tables, chairs and irons pitched all over inside the house without being moved or touched by anyone. The most common and disturbing phenomenon, however, continued to be the pelting on the roof. Perhaps surprisingly, given the violent nature of the happenings, despite the constant throwing of stones by unseen hands, the lumps of rock, which were claimed to vary in weight between 2 ounces and a pound, did not injure anyone. That said, the phenomena did seem to target Ivy, who was also the only person able to see the figures, the spirits who she believed were responsible. After all, according to Excelia's account, whenever Ivy was present, more stones would fall, but when she was not there, everything was quiet. Ivy somehow seemed to be connected to the occurrences, and yet the teenage girl was not the only target of the supernatural pelting. Her Aunt Dolly, who left the house to stay with a friend soon after the phenomena began, was rumoured to have been the intended recipient of the paranormal attack, with stones said to have fallen ostentatiously on the roof above her bedroom. Not merely that, but as the phenomena escalated, letters addressing her, as well as foul-looking paper packets mingled with the stones, are said to have fallen upon the roof. Described in press reports from the time, these would contain greasy matter, garlic, coarse salt, bits of broken glass, and a variety of other materials properly associated with the practice of obeah. Obeah being the traditional Caribbean witchcraft that is derived from African folk religions, and that is practiced by so-called obeah men who enlist the help of spirits to do their bidding, particularly in seeking justice. Were the occurrences, then, some manner of curse or witchcraft assault? For indeed, before too long the happenings escalated once again, with the stone throwing and other inexplicable activity, once seemingly aimless, evolving to possess purpose. On one occasion, Detective Bernardine recounted that after removing stones and bottles from the roof, Ivy went up there and immediately alerted him that she saw a man sitting with a parcel in his hand. When the detective returned to the roof, he found a paper parcel containing a sort of powder and a script, a short piece of writing threatening Ivy, warning her to leave the place by 7 o'clock or else she would be dead. He retrieved the objects, a bottle with some liquid, the script, and a paper with powder, and handed them over to the chief of police. According to the detective, the house stood from 6 to 8 feet from the ground on one side, and on the roadside about 3 feet. No one went onto the roof of the house during the time that he was there, and so he was certain that the objects on the roof did not get there by normal man-made means. Fortunately, whatever the monotonous object's origin, no harm befell Ivy that day. On yet another occasion, one of the letters found mingled with the stones is said to have solemnly warned Ivy that if she respected her good name, she should withdraw herself entirely from Dolly's influence, confirming the rumours that Dolly had indeed been the intended victim of the supernatural attack. And so, disheartened and afraid, nearly 2 months into the disturbance, Excelia reached out to African religious figures for help. She described how, in November, she was helped by them in making a sacrifice, with them praying with her for 3 days inside the property, during which time the pelting ceased. However, merely 2 hours after the helpers left the cottage, the pelting attack began once more. Although the ritual had failed, Excelia is said to have stuck to the house for some weeks thereafter, until she could not endure it any longer, and stopped spending the night in her home. And so it was that less than 3 months into the phenomena, the cottage was completely deserted by all of its occupants, although Excelia is believed to have occasionally visited during the day. That was until the 14th of January 1935, when a mysterious fire ripped through the building, utterly devouring it. It happened at night and, oddly, according to Excelia's testimony, for 8 days before the cottage had been free of phenomena. An inquiry into the origin of the fire was held on the 23rd of January before His Worship C.H. Lucas, acting magistrate of the Western District. During the inquiry, not merely was it made clear that no one was living in the property at the time, Excelia was also adamant that no fire was lit in the house from the time of the sacrifice ending in November, making the origin of the fire all the more puzzling. And so, after 2 days of hearing, the magistrate found that there was no evidence whatsoever as to the cause or origin of the fire, enforcing the belief among locals and those involved that just like the stone throwing and other moving objects, there had been supernatural and sinister forces behind the disaster. Examining the testimonies and press reports from the time, it seems as though the paranormal phenomena peaked with the mysterious fire. With the building burnt to the ground, Excelia and her family did not report further disturbances thereafter. Whatever the phenomena might have been, it was location-bound and did not follow the residents elsewhere. Or perhaps its purpose had been served, with the fire, destructive and absolute, being the desired outcome. After all, the impact of the paranormal manifestation was profound. After driving Excelia and her family away from the home, it took the cottage down completely, and not merely that, affected Dolly in more ways than one. A later notice published in the West Indian newspaper reported that Dolly, who was supposedly the intended target of the supernatural attack, had been defamed by locals, who gave her the nickname Dracula, after the original film inspired by Bram Stoker's novel had been shown on the island a short time prior. Dolly, so the newspaper reported, initiated a defamation of character lawsuit against her attackers, the verdict of which ruled in her favour, with her being awarded the munificent sum of 10 shillings for damages. And so it seems that at least one of the family members experienced some sort of closure after the horrific happenings. From where we stand today, not much is known about the rest. And despite the diligent reporting of the West Indian on the case, as well as the involvement of local authorities, the origin of the manifestation at Lothars Lane remains shrouded in mystery. After all, if the manifestation was indeed caused by Obeah, as was indicated, who was the person responsible and what was their motive? And more importantly, and chillingly, why was Ivy the only one able to see the man in white and his equally ethereal companions, who she believed were the spirits responsible for the disturbances? Herbert Thurston, the Roman Catholic priest and expert on spiritualism who documented this case in his writings, noted that, although poltergeist phenomena are generally supposed by the skeptical to be the work of artful and mischievous children, In many cases, which seem to have been carefully observed and reported, the physical effects are of a nature quite incompatible with child agency. A child may produce strange noises or throw an occasional stone, but the movement of heavy furniture or the flinging of missiles that enter a room from outside when the child is in the room and actually under observation cannot be explained in that way. Certainly this appears to have been the case at the Lothers Lane cottage. Whilst the inexplicable activity did seem to swirl about the teenage girl, the intensity and physical logistics of the stone throwing are not easily explained by teenage fakery. As Thurston wrote, the hypothesis of a mischievous urchin playing pranks completely breaks down. In fact, he believed that, despite Ivy's seemingly suspicious character, her sensitivity to the spirit world and potential mediumistic faculty may have been the origin of the phenomena. After all, although there are exceptions, poltergeist phenomena do seem to center around individuals at the peak of their psychical sensitivity, with such individuals often happening to be children or teenagers at the threshold of adulthood. Whether this is because they attract paranormal happenings like some manner of metaphysical magnet, or whether they coax them into being, it can only be speculated. Intriguing, however, is how such sensitive individuals may be influenced in their manifestations by the type of spirituality present in their environments. In this way, it is interesting to reflect upon how Ivy grew up in an environment where folklore is abundant in tales of duppies, spirits of the dead who can manifest in human or animal form, or malevolent entities who are believed to cast stones upon the living and their dwellings, especially at night. And so some would speculate that, on the one hand, the poltergeist on Lothers Lane could have been manifested by 15-year-old Ivy, who was influenced by the atmosphere of voodoo and obeah, which is prevalent in greater or lesser measure in all the West Indian islands, and which in the 1930s can be considered to have been fruitful soil for the ready acceptance of stories of duppies and their stone-throwing propensities. Then, on the other hand, another explanation may argue that, due to her supposed peaking adolescent psychic abilities, Ivy merely picked up on the machinations of an obeah man, who enlisted the help of spirits against her Aunt Dolly. After all, the letters which accompanied the stones were addressed to or referenced her, with, as the later defamation trial evidences, Dolly having flesh and blood enemies in the town. Is it then a sensible step to suggest that these enemies may have stretched into the supernatural? Either way, given the large number of eyewitnesses in this case, a wholly material explanation is difficult to pinpoint. And fascinatingly, most stories of stone-throwing phenomena, for such a surprisingly well-reported, do seem to lack human agency, and be solely the manifestation of mischievous entities, such as devilish imps and duppies, who do not seek to physically injure, but to disturb in every other way the recipients of their stone casting. According to an account by Reverend Abraham J. Emmerich, a Jesuit missionary who took up work in Jamaica in 1895, one of the favourite pastimes of the duppies is stone throwing. To sustain his claim, he recounted a first-hand experience with the phenomenon while he was on a mission to Alva School. The stone throwing there, so he reported, began a week before he arrived at the school, and while on his way to the location, he was warned by others that duppies were throwing stones there at night and even stoned the teacher away. The disturbance, similar to the Grenada case, attracted crowds of people every night who claimed that the stones were thrown from various directions, but most of them seemed to come from a bush-covered ravine. They also told the Reverend that those who were hit by the stones were not injured, and that some of the stones which came from the bushy declivity, after smashing through the window, turned at a right angle and broke the teacher's clock and glasses on a sideboard. In spite of the warning, the Reverend continued on his way to the school. He claimed that, upon arriving, he found the building littered with stones and broken windows. It was, so it was reported, a generally smashed up, sure enough, ghost-haunted place. He later learnt that before the phenomenon began, the teacher and another employee at the school noticed a suspicious person lurking around the premises. Soon after the man arrived, stones began falling on the school and inside of it, at first one by one, but gradually very plentiful. Some were even said to have come through the open door, turn around, and fall at the teacher's feet. Oddly, one of the 3 people present was reported to have marked a stone and thrown it out, requesting that if the entity was a true duppy, then it should throw the marked stone back. The marked stone was indeed thrown back, proving to those present that the stone thrower was a true duppy. Another Jesuit missionary, Father John L. Lucchesi, recounted yet another stone-throwing incident that occurred in Bastia, Corsica, just before the start of his missions in 1896. He was called to a large academy for girls that was under the care of the Sisters of St. Joseph from Lyon, France. It was claimed that, out of nowhere, little stones and pebbles began falling in the yard of the academy, without, however, striking or hurting anybody. The phenomenon went on for days, and nobody could see where the stones were coming from, and so Father John was sent to investigate. According to a letter he wrote to Herbert Thurston, he saw with his own eyes the rain of pebbles that were falling pretty thickly all around him, although he could not find any cause or explanation. He recalled having to pray with copious aspersions of holy water. After 1 or 2 days, the activity ceased and did not return. And so there is no shortage of stories about stone-throwing poltergeists, some more believable than others. In particular, we have seen similar in the case of Eleonora Zugan, today remembered as the Devil's Girl, whose poltergeist case began likewise with stones being hurtled against her house by an unseen force. In her case, the same as the West Indian poltergeist, human agency was dismissed. Whether by the design of mischievous entities or human agents like bearmen or folk witches, the supernatural launching of stones seems to be among the most common occurrences in poltergeist phenomena. Although it is impossible to determine why this is, there is symbolism that can be derived from esoteric lore. Often, the victims of stone-throwing poltergeists are cruelly and unfairly scrutinized by their falsely righteous neighbors, who justify the paranormal stoning as biblical punishment carried out with the agreement of divinity. However, the misconstrued belief falls flat when confronted with the stoning of martyrs by pagans and demons who were hell-bent on tormenting the recipients of their attacks. Perhaps a more appropriate meaning for stone-throwing poltergeists, then, can be found in the lore of such elemental spirits that are believed by demonologists to be able to move rocks and even mountains for the witches they serve. Witches who, in order to cast a curse, must first cast a stone in the direction of the person they wish to paranormally afflict. In this way, such spirits as duppies, devilish imps, goblins and kobolds may very well be casting stones to help their masters seek the justice they think they deserve, as is suggested in the Lothars Lane case. Or they might simply do so to remind us of their power, and that despite how it may seem otherwise, the world which we inhabit, we do not inhabit alone. Thank you so much for watching. I very much hope you enjoyed this video. If you did and are new to my channel, you might like to explore some of my other videos, including the ones linked on screen now. Equally, I have more content for you to enjoy over on my second channel, Laura Rowton. And to those of you who have been following me for some time, including my members both here and on Patreon, I want to thank you for a marvelous 2023 and wish you and your loved ones all the very best for 2024. Until next time,